welcome to the Energy Connect Studio, Gastech 2023. I'm delighted to have sitting once again with me, Joe McMonigle, Secretary General of the International Energy Forum, IEF. Thank you so much for joining me, Joe.
Great to be back at Gastech.
Yes, and Gastech here in Singapore.
That's right.
Now, 2022 was an extraordinary year for the gas market, but we've got winter coming up again. What do you see are in store for markets over the coming months up to the end of the year?
Yeah, so I think we're in store for another, I think, tight winter. I think Europe really made some, got some breathing room because of convenience about weather. Obviously the high LNG prices last year, I think, attracted a lot of LNG, particularly from the US, and they were able to get some cargoes rerouted. But it wouldn't take much for, even though the inventories are higher, it wouldn't take much for a couple weeks of colder than normal weather to see those inventories decline and us to be back in another situation. And I think most forecasting agencies expect not just this winter, but the next 2 or 3 winters in Europe to be particularly dicey. The other interesting, I think, phenomenon this year is, of course, China was able to basically reroute some of these cargoes because of lower than normal demand, but now China is really fully opened, and so I think the likelihood that those cargoes will be rerouted to come to Europe's rescue, I think, it's probably not going to happen again this winter, and so that'll be a big change from last year. And I think the most important thing is for no one to get complacent. I mean, sometimes I listen to some policymakers talk about it and feel like like Europe's out of the woods, and I don't think that's the case at all. And privately, I think ministers and CEOs of different companies acknowledge that. But the other important part of it is to realize that whatever's happening in Europe affects the rest of the market. I mean, the gas market is increasingly interconnected and global, and we saw with the threat of the strike in Australia what that did to prices. That's just 10% of the market. But last year you had prices climb, and that affected, in fact, not just affected, but priced out of the market countries like Pakistan and other developing countries who had to revert back to coal and abandon gas strategies. So what happens in Europe is not just important for Europe, but it's because it's an increasingly interconnected global gas market, it affects other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely, and do you feel those kind of conversations will happen here at Gastech, talking about these shifts in LNG patterns, and important to have a big gas and LNG show here in Singapore?
Absolutely. I mean, Asia and Southeast Asia in particular is really the driver, I think, of growth in natural gas consumption and demand. And I mean, China's its own separate market, and I think we're going to see China return because of the domestic demand increases in China. But you're also increasingly seeing, gas where it's used as a feedstock. That's also coming back in terms of increasing demand. So I think globally we're in a very tight market. It's a situation where we have to keep talking about investment in new supplies. I think the era of low natural gas or LNG rates, I think, are probably behind us. Or at least we were at peak low prices for LNG, and I think increasingly you're going to see the market respond because there's just greater demand for natural gas.
And I mean, the vital importance of investment, and you've talked about this before, but it's important, I think, to drum on about investment has been low, and companies and governments need to look at that. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we talk generally about investment in hydrocarbons in general, and essentially, I mean, you hear a lot of the war in Ukraine spiked prices for oil and gas, but really the energy crisis was here way before the invasion of Ukraine, and that's because of a lack of investment in new supply, it's important that we pay attention to that, because what I argue is that if you care about climate action and progress on the transition, you have to manage the transition, and by that I mean you have to keep an eye on prices. Because if prices jump too high or there's so much volatility, it hurts consumers, it hurts the public, it hurts public treasuries who are often having to come in with subsidies and bailing out companies. And so, but it's important because if voters and consumers start to connect high prices and volatility with the transition, we're in big trouble because I think we lose and risk public support for the climate. So we have to pay attention to this volatility, and by that, the only way to address that is to invest in new hydrocarbon supplies until we have alternatives that can replace it. And right now we don't have that.
No, we don't. And energy security, so many more countries have been looking or focusing on this. How have you seen this express itself in the gas markets? And you've touched on a bit of there, but have lessons been learned from the gas crisis in 2020, 2021?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think some countries are now much more focused on energy security. 3 years ago at a conference like this, you would whisper about energy security in the hallways. Now it's talking about quite openly. And for some countries, it's the main priority. I think the important thing for policymakers is to keep, is not to pursue energy security at the expense of energy transition. We have to do both. I mean, that's the answer. And we have to make progress on climate while we address these energy security issues, because again, as I said, they're interrelated, because if there is no security of supply, it affects prices, that affects consumers, hurts consumers, it also influences how they view the transition. And we don't want to undermine public support for what frankly are going to be very challenging and big asks of the public.
Yes, and I understand the IEF have been conducting a series of dialogues on the transition. What insights have you gathered from this process, and anything in regards to sort of Asia and the gas markets that's come out of these dialogues?
Yeah, that's right. We basically have wrapped up a year of energy roundtable dialogues. We started at Africa Energy Week in South Africa, and we've held events in Indonesia during the G20. We held events in Latin America, in Europe, in the US. And essentially these were listening sessions. What are the lessons we learned from the energy crisis and while we're pursuing the energy transition? And the main takeaway was that really this linear approach to net zero, the one pathway idea, that's really an outdated approach. And what we've learned from policymakers and stakeholders and corporate leaders is that there needs to be a multidimensional approach. In other words, sometimes I talk about it as the price fix menu versus the a la carte menu. I mean, in this case, the price fix menu, the one pathway to net zero, is actually quite expensive. In normal restaurant talk, the price fix is generally a deal. In an energy policy in the transition, it's the most expensive route. It's also not available in other parts of the world. So we have to pursue sort of an a la carte approach where different countries can pursue different avenues, different roadmaps. Different countries are beginning at different starting points. And they have certain natural resources that they want to utilize. But the main objective of getting to net zero, I think that's shared by everybody, but we have to provide the flexibility for every country to pursue its own pathway. And so that's essentially what we learned. We're going to start, I think, doing more on what are some other pathways, some low-cost pathways to getting to net zero. And natural gas is a big part of it. As I said in a panel here in the opening session, natural gas is one of the key components to global decarbonization. And we have to repeat that, because it's not just, gas and LNG by themselves are actually a decarbonization technology. Then you add in things like CCUS and different carbon management technologies and methane abatement, and it can become even more of a decarbonization tool. And so we need to, and of course it has a huge role in hydrogen as well. So natural gas is a key part of the transition, and decarbonization.
That's great to hear, Jen. I agree on a lot of those points. And also, some of the findings you've had, can you take these to COP or 28 in the UAE towards the end of the year, or what are you doing?
Well, I think gas is already part of the conversation. Look, there are still in some parties resistance to natural gas because it's just viewed as a hydrocarbon. But I think as we approach COP, I think the key question is, are we going to pursue progress over perfection? And I'm hopeful with a CEO in charge of the COP presidency, someone who monitors metrics at a company. We're going to start looking at progress, because I think too often at different COP meetings, it's been about perfect solutions, pursuing the perfection, elusive solutions that you can never get any kind of consensus or agreement around. Instead, there's so many things we could be doing today on methane, on coal to gas switching, so many different technologies that are on the shelf now and available, that if we focus on them, we can make tremendous progress on the transition while we pursue other technologies that could potentially take the place of hydrocarbons. But right now, they don't exist.
No, and let's see what comes out, and hopefully it is that angle that comes out. Just before we go, I know you're a regular visitor to Gastech. What are you looking forward to at the conferences this year? I know you were on a panel earlier today.
Yeah, we had a great panel with different ministers to find out some of their pathways to pursuing decarbonization. And every country, very interesting, every country has their own specific avenues that they're pursuing that are different from the others. And that's great. We have to allow countries to pursue that. I think the other key issue that came up in my panel, and you're hearing here at Gastech, is about investment. Green financing, which is really important. Right now there's also a conference happening in Africa, the first climate conference in Africa, and I think one of the key outcomes that I'm looking for from that conference is, are we going to make it easier for countries on the African continent and in the developing world in Asia to be able to get access to capital? Because right now, even for renewables, the cost of capital is extremely high in Africa and other parts of the developing world here in Asia. And so that needs to be addressed. I think we also have to look at reforms in terms of these international financing agencies, and re-examining these bans on hydrocarbons in the developing world that really need, especially gas, and develop infrastructure for gas to, again, make it a decarbonization tool in their net zero pathways.
Well, Joe, interesting times ahead, and will be a busy year as we lead up to COP and ADIPEC as well. Always a pleasure to have you down. Thanks for coming.
Same. Great to be here.
Thanks everyone for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more studio interviews from the show floor in the coming days.